I was standing in the cereal aisle of a grocery store, 39 years old, exhausted after a double shift, when I heard a voice behind me say my name, the exact way he used to say it when we were 19. I turned around, and there was Daniel, 17 years older, still with that same crooked smile, standing there like no time had passed at all. But to understand why that moment undid me completely, I need to take you back to the summer we fell in love the first time, and the reason we ever let each other go. I met Daniel the summer I turned 19, at a lake house my college roommate's family owned, during a week that still exists in my memory with a kind of golden, almost unbearable clarity, the way only certain early loves seem to. He was a friend of my roommate's older brother, 2 years ahead of me in school, working a summer job as a lifeguard at the lake, and I remember the exact moment I first noticed him, mid-laugh at something someone else had said, his whole face changing shape with it in a way that struck me instantly as the most genuine thing I'd seen in a long time. That first week unfolded in the particular, unhurried way summer weeks did before responsibility fully caught up with any of us. Mornings meant lying out on the dock with a paperback I rarely actually read, more interested in watching Daniel's lifeguard shift from a distance than in whatever plot I was pretending to follow. Afternoons meant the whole group of us piling into someone's boat, Daniel steering with an easy confidence that felt, at 19, impossibly attractive in ways I couldn't fully articulate at the time. Evenings meant bonfires on the shore, the specific charged awkwardness of maneuvering myself to sit near him without making the effort too obvious to the rest of our friends. We spent that entire week finding excuses to end up near each other, long conversations on the dock after everyone else had gone to bed, the specific, electric awkwardness of two people who both know exactly what's happening between them but haven't yet said it out loud. I remember one particular night, maybe 4 days into that week, when we finally admitted, in the halting, overly careful language of new attraction, that we'd both been finding excuses to be near each other all week. Our first kiss happened that same night, standing at the very end of that same dock under a sky so full of stars it felt almost theatrical in its perfection, the specific kind of moment that becomes, later, a story you tell so many times it starts to feel like it happened to someone else. By the end of that week, we were inseparable in the particular, all-consuming way only very young love manages to be, the kind that convinces you, with complete sincerity, that you found the one singular person the entire world was arranged to eventually deliver to you. Daniel and I dated for almost 2 years after that summer, through the specific chaos of finishing college in different cities, hours of phone calls, weekend visits that always ended in the particular ache of goodbye at a bus station or an airport gate. We were, by any reasonable measure, genuinely happy together, the kind of couple our mutual friends assumed would eventually get married, an assumption I shared myself, quietly, in the specific way you allow yourself to imagine a future with someone before life has had the chance to complicate it. I remember visiting Daniel at his university during our second year together, a long weekend that felt, at the time, like a genuine preview of what a shared adult life with him might actually look like. We cooked dinner together in his cramped shared apartment kitchen, argued affectionately about whose turn it was to wash dishes, fell asleep on his couch during a movie neither of us finished watching. Small, unremarkable domestic moments that felt, at 20, like evidence of something durable and real, the specific kind of proof young love collects to convince itself it's found something permanent. The end of our relationship, when it came, wasn't dramatic in the way breakups are sometimes portrayed. There was no betrayal, no single decisive fight. We simply arrived, separately and then together, at the specific, painful realization that our post-graduation plans were pulling us toward entirely different lives. I had a job opportunity waiting in a city on the opposite coast from where Daniel intended to attend graduate school, and neither of us, at 21, felt equipped to ask the other to sacrifice a genuine opportunity for a relationship that still felt, despite how deeply we loved each other, too young and too uncertain to build an entire life's compromise around. We spent almost a month, that final spring, having the same difficult conversation in different forms, both of us trying to find some version of the future that didn't require either of us to give up something significant. I remember Daniel suggesting, at one particularly emotional point, that he could try to find a graduate program near wherever I ended up instead, an offer that touched me deeply but that I ultimately talked him out of, some clear-eyed part of me recognizing, even at 21, that building our entire future around a decision made from fear of losing each other wasn't the same thing as building it from genuine, independent choice. I remember our actual last conversation with a specificity that surprises me even now, sitting on the same dock where we'd first fallen for each other 2 years earlier, both of us crying in the particular, restrained way you cry when you're trying to be mature about something that doesn't feel mature at all. We agreed, that day, that we'd always care about each other, that this wasn't really an ending so much as a pause neither of us could responsibly promise would ever resume. I believed that, at the time, with the same complete sincerity I'd believed everything else about us. Life, as it does, moved forward from there in ways neither of us could have predicted. I built a career in healthcare administration, eventually became a hospital operations manager, work that gave me genuine purpose even through the particular exhaustion of double shifts and understaffed departments. I married, in my late 20s, a man named Mark, a marriage that lasted almost a decade before ending, amicably enough, in a divorce driven less by any specific betrayal than by the slow, quiet realization that we'd become better friends than partners somewhere along the way. I raised my daughter, Emma, largely as a single parent after that, building a life that felt, by my late 30s, settled and complete in its own right, even if it looked nothing like the future I'd once imagined at 19 on that dock. Those years between Daniel and the grocery store encounter were full and mostly genuinely happy ones, even accounting for the specific difficulty of the divorce and the ordinary exhaustion of single parenthood. I built close friendships, took real pride in the career I'd developed, watched Emma grow into a specific, funny, opinionated person I found endlessly interesting to be around. I want to be clear that I wasn't waiting for Daniel during any of those years, wasn't nursing some quiet, unresolved longing beneath the surface of an otherwise full life. I had genuinely moved forward, in every meaningful sense, building a life I was proud of on its own terms. I hadn't thought about Daniel in any sustained way for years by the time I saw him again, not out of any deliberate effort to forget him, but simply because life had filled in around the space he'd once occupied, the way it eventually does with even our most significant early loves. I knew, vaguely, through mutual friends we'd both long since lost touch with directly, that he'd become an architect, that he'd married at some point, though I didn't know any further details, having deliberately avoided the specific temptation of searching for him online, some instinct telling me it wouldn't serve me well to watch his life unfold from a careful, curated distance. The grocery store encounter happened on an entirely unremarkable Tuesday evening, the kind of ordinary errand that makes what happened next feel almost absurdly mundane in retrospect. I was exhausted after a difficult double shift, standing in the cereal aisle trying to remember which brand Emma preferred that week, when I heard someone say my name behind me, my full name, in the exact particular cadence Daniel had always used, a cadence I recognized instantly despite not having heard it in 17 years. I turned around and there he was, older obviously, a few genuine lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, but unmistakably, immediately Daniel, the same crooked smile appearing the moment our eyes met, as though absolutely no time had passed between the version of him I'd known at 19 and the version standing in front of me now. I remember the specific, disorienting vertigo of that moment, my exhausted, unremarkable Tuesday evening suddenly containing a person who existed, in my memory, entirely within the golden, unbothered simplicity of being 19 years old and hopelessly in love. For several long seconds, neither of us said anything beyond his initial greeting. Both of us, I think, doing the same rapid mental math, calculating 17 years against the face in front of us, trying to reconcile memory with the actual, present reality of this unexpected encounter. He was the one who finally broke the silence, gesturing vaguely at the shopping cart between us, making some small, self-deprecating joke about running into your entire past in a cereal aisle, a joke that broke whatever strange tension had settled over us and let us both, finally, actually laugh. We stood in that cereal aisle talking for almost 45 minutes, an absurd amount of time to spend blocking grocery store traffic. catching each other up on nearly 2 decades of life in the compressed, imperfect way you do when trying to summarize an entire adulthood to someone who last knew you as a completely different person. He told me, carefully, that he'd been divorced for almost 3 years, no children, a marriage that had ended for reasons he described only briefly, with the specific restraint of someone who'd clearly done real work processing it rather than still carrying active anger about it. I told him about Emma, about my own divorce, about the specific, unglamorous satisfaction of the career I built in hospital administration. Neither of us suggested, in that first conversation, anything beyond the obvious catching up two old friends might do. But I remember driving home that evening with a specific lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to fully examine, a feeling I recognized, with some discomfort, as unmistakably similar to the specific electricity of that first summer at the lake house, dormant for 17 years, but apparently not, it turned out, entirely gone. Daniel found my number through a mutual friend about a week later, texting with a kind of careful, deliberate casualness that made clear he'd thought carefully about how to reach out without presuming too much. We started, slowly, exchanging texts, then longer phone calls, both of us navigating the strange, specific territory of reconnecting with someone who occupies an entirely unique category in your emotional history, neither quite a stranger nor quite someone you can pick back up with exactly where you left off. I want to talk about the specific complexity of falling for someone again after this much time has passed, because I think it's a different experience entirely from either falling for someone new or simply resuming an old relationship. Daniel wasn't the same person I'd loved at 19, and I wasn't the same person either, both of us shaped by 2 decades of separate lives, separate marriages, separate griefs, and successes the other hadn't witnessed firsthand. What I found, over the weeks that followed, wasn't simply the resurrection of old feelings, but something new being built on top of genuine, deep familiarity, a specific combination that felt entirely different from anything I'd experienced in the intervening years. Our first actual date, several weeks after the grocery store encounter, happened at the same lake, though a different house, since the original one had long since been sold. Daniel picked me up that evening in a car that felt strange in its unfamiliarity, another small reminder of just how much time had actually passed since we'd last known each other's daily lives, back when I could have told you the exact make and model of whatever he'd been driving at 21 without a second thought. We were both, I think, a little nervous in a way that felt almost surreal given how genuinely comfortable our grocery store conversation had been, as though the deliberateness of an actual planned date carried a different, higher stakes weight than the accident of running into each other. We spent the evening walking along the shore, and at some point, without either of us fully planning it, we ended up sitting on a dock, an echo of that first summer so unmistakable that we both acknowledged it out loud, laughing at the specific, almost impossible symmetry of it. Daniel told me that evening, with a directness he hadn't quite had at 21, that he'd thought about me periodically over the years, wondered occasionally how my life had unfolded, never with any specific regret about our choices at the time, but with a kind of persistent, quiet curiosity that he said had never fully resolved itself into anything he acted on. I told him something similar, admitting, with a vulnerability that surprised me given how carefully I'd guarded my emotional life since my divorce, that I'd occasionally caught myself, over the years, comparing certain qualities in other relationships to qualities I remembered from ours, an admission that felt almost embarrassing to voice out loud, but that Daniel received with a kind of gentle, unguarded warmth that made the vulnerability feel worthwhile. We talked that night until well past midnight, the specific kind of conversation that makes you lose track of time entirely, covering everything from our respective divorces to our current daily lives to, eventually, tentatively, what we each actually wanted from whatever this reconnect ion might become. I want to be honest about the fear that accompanied all of this, because I think it matters for anyone listening who's ever considered reopening a door they closed a long time ago. I was genuinely afraid, in those early weeks, that whatever we were building was simply nostalgia dressed up as genuine connection, that I was falling for a specific, golden memory of who Daniel had been at 19 rather than the actual, fully formed adult standing in front of me now. I talked about this fear directly with Daniel, maybe 2 months into reconnecting. And he told me he'd had the exact same worry, that we owed it to ourselves and to whatever this actually was to move slowly enough to find out whether we genuinely fit as the people we'd each become, rather than simply chasing the specific high of unfinished young love. We made a deliberate decision, around that point, to actively test that fear rather than simply hoping it would resolve itself. We spent time together in genuinely unglamorous, ordinary contexts, running errands together, sitting through a difficult conversation about a work conflict I was navigating, watching how each of us handled stress and disagreement rather than only experiencing each other during the curated, emotionally heightened context of reunion. I remember one particular evening, several months in, when Daniel and I had our first real disagreement as adults reconnecting, a minor but genuine conflict about scheduling that revealed real, adult incompatibilities in how we each approached planning and commitment. Working through that disagreement, rather than the nostalgia of the reunion itself, was what finally convinced me that what we were building was something real and durable, not simply an echo of who we'd once been. My close friend Rachel, who'd actually been at that original lake house 17 years earlier and remembered Daniel from that first summer, expressed her own cautious concern when I first told her about the reconnect I worried, in her words, that I was chasing a specific fantasy of what my life might have looked like if we'd stayed together, rather than genuinely evaluating who Daniel actually was now. I appreciated her honesty, even as it stung a little, and I made a point of introducing them again once Daniel and I had been reconnecting for several months, wanting her genuine, updated assessment of him as the adult he'd actually become rather than the memory she'd carried of him as a 21-year-old. Introducing Daniel to Emma took real care and deliberate patience, since she was 12 by then, old enough to have complicated feelings about her mother dating anyone, let alone someone with this particular, unusual history. I waited almost 4 months before Daniel and Emma met properly, wanting to be certain, first, that this relationship had genuine staying power before introducing that kind of significant change into her life. I remember the specific anxiety of preparing Emma for that first meeting, trying to explain, in language appropriate for a 12-year-old, the strange, almost storybook circumstance of this particular relationship, a first love reappearing after 17 years. Emma, with the particular bluntness children her age sometimes have, asked whether this meant I'd been secretly sad about him the whole time I was married to her father, a question that required careful, honest handling, since I wanted her to understand that loving Daniel now didn't diminish or complicate the genuine love I'd had for her father, that these were simply two different, equally real chapters of my life rather than one being a consolation for the other. Their first meeting was, thankfully, easier than I'd anticipated, Daniel showing up with genuine, unforced interest in whatever Emma wanted to talk about, patient in a way that reminded me, with a specific ache, of exactly the qualities that had drawn me to him in the first place all those years ago at that lake house. He'd done his research beforehand, I later learned, asking me detailed questions about Emma's interests so he could actually engage meaningfully rather than performing the kind of generic, adult-pleasing interest children can usually see through immediately. Their relationship grew slowly over the following months, built on Daniel's consistent, patient presence rather than any grand gesture, until Emma began, entirely on her own initiative, inviting him to her school events, a shift I recognized as the clearest possible sign that whatever wariness she'd initially carried had genuinely resolved into real affection. Daniel and I have been together for 3 years now, a relationship built with a kind of deliberate care neither of us, I think, would have been capable of at 21, back when we first loved each other with all the intensity and none of the perspective that only comes with genuinely surviving an entire adult life in between. We got married last spring, a small ceremony at, unsurprisingly, a lake house, though not the original one, since that specific piece of nostalgia felt, by then, less important than simply building something new together in a setting that echoed, without needing to replicate exactly where this all began. Emma, by then 15, stood up during the reception and offered a short, unplanned toast that undid nearly everyone in the room, describing, with the particular clarity teenagers sometimes surprise you with, how she'd watched her mother become visibly lighter and happier over the 3 years of dating Daniel, and how grateful she was that grocery store errand had happened on exactly that Tuesday evening rather than any other day. Rachel, who walked me down a short aisle of folding chairs set up on the lawn, whispered to me beforehand that she'd never seen me look more certain of anything in the entire time she'd known me, certainty being, she pointed out, something notably absent from my first wedding, a distinction I'd noticed myself but hadn't fully articulated until she named it. Daniel's own parents, who I hadn't seen since that original summer 17 years earlier, attended the wedding as well, his mother crying through most of the ceremony, telling me afterward that she'd always privately hoped, in some quiet, sentimental corner of her heart, that Daniel and I would eventually find our way back to each other, though she'd never said so directly to either of us over the years in between, not wanting to interfere with whatever paths our separate lives were taking. I think often about the specific mercy of second chances, how easily Daniel and I could have simply remained a fond, distant memory to each other, two people who once loved each other deeply at 19 and eventually became nothing more than an occasional, wistful thought triggered by an old song or a particular season. I think about the specific randomness of a Tuesday evening grocery run, an errand I could have easily delayed to another day, another store, an entirely different version of my life unfolding from that small, unremarkable choice. I've thought, too, about what might have happened if either of us had married someone else who was still in the picture at the moment of that grocery store encounter, how differently and how much more painfully that chance meeting might have unfolded if it had arrived at a moment when reopening this particular door wasn't actually available to either of us. I don't take for granted the specific timing that allowed Daniel and me to find each other again exactly when we were both genuinely free to explore what it might become without the complication of active commitments elsewhere. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: not every ending is actually an ending. Sometimes the people we love and lose simply exist on pause, waiting for circumstances, and the people we've each grown into in the meantime to finally align in a way they couldn't when we were too young to build the life such love actually deserved. I don't think everyone gets a second chance with a first love, but for those of us lucky enough to encounter one, I think it's worth having the courage to find out whether what you're feeling is simply nostalgia or something genuinely, patiently waiting to be built again, properly, by the people you've both actually become.